Today we have Dr. Richard Koestner, a psychologist and professor from McGill University who researches goal setting and motivation. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Richard Koestner. You'll pick up that I have a New York accent. Somehow, I don't know exactly how I ended up in Montreal. I've been here for 33 years, and I've been studying motivation probably for 40 years. So it's something that I've cared about for quite a while.
Do you recall what kind of motivated you into studying psychology to begin with?
It's a good question. I think I've always been psychologically minded, so I've always tried to understand differences between people in their personality. I do some things with my daughter when she was younger, so I would say, "Oh, do you think those two are brother and sister, or those two strangers, or those two boyfriend girlfriend?" Or whenever there's ambiguity about kind of relationships, I'm curious what exactly is the relationship there and how can we infer it. And I think with motivation, most of us, we have a rough idea of, boy, this is a motivated person and this is an unmotivated person. But I always suspected there was more nuance and more interesting differentiations to make. And I would guess I was always suspicious of the people who seemed super motivated, and whether they were motivated for extrinsic reasons or for driven reasons, or whether what I would call more autonomous or authentic reasons. So, yeah, I would guess that I've always been interested in the nuances of why people are doing what they're doing, and how we could understand what they're striving for and what they're working at.
On the point of determining whether people are like related or if they're dating, I just, it is kind of funny because I'm not sure if you're aware of, there's a video trend called couples or dating that a lot of people find.
I like that one.
Yeah. Because I think there is also that, it also lends to that study that people tend to date people that they look similar to, and perhaps even personality wise there might be some like coherence there. That is actually, that it seems to, I think you'd agree, it shows a lot about personality, like depending on, I think, genetics and attraction and so forth.
Yeah. I once heard that, and this was an expert on mating, that we're drawn to someone who looks like our third cousin. not our first cousin, but it's very specifically like our third cousin who is what we're drawn to. But I didn't know there was a trend where are they dating or... but I think that does happen. And I remember on the first date I went with my wife, it was on Saint Laurent. We went for pizza, and there was a blackout. But because it was a wood-burning pizza oven, they were still able to serve us. And then when the waiter came by later, he says, "You two are on a date, aren't you?" So he could pick up something that we were on a first date. But I guess what I would... So I think I was always psychologically oriented, although I didn't really have a notion of becoming a psychologist. I wanted to be a social worker, and gradually I changed to psychologist.
What kind of made you decide between social worker and psychologist? Because social worker, I'd assume that's like very involved, and you would have to handle people sometimes in very difficult situations.
Yeah, well, my daughter's now a social work student, so I know they do a lot of different kinds of things. For me, it was mostly I went to a Jesuit high school that was very liberal and very committed to, doing something useful with your life where you were helping others. So I think it was a values-based decision, and it kind of ignored what I was interested in and what I was good at and what I was motivated to do. Uh, and it's funny, after 2 years at Columbia, I met with my advisor, and she looked at my grades and she said, "Why are you going for social work? You could go for clinical psychology." And there was kind of a status elite aspect to one profession versus the other profession. And so I thought, okay, I'll go for clinical psychology. And, uh, I was licensed as a clinical psychologist, but I only practiced for a short time. And much to my surprise, what I liked most was research and teaching. And that's been my career. Sometimes wish I had done something more practical and hands-on and that I'd tried to help more people directly. But so that's how I ended up in psychology. But as you'll find yourself, Ben, if you go to graduate school, even as you're going through 5 years of a PhD program, you'll be torn between, should I be a researcher? Should I be a clinician? In your case, should you be a podcaster and a philosopher? And what I find is, especially when you're good at a lot of things like you are, it's hard to figure out really what you want to go with. And I know people who've changed their minds and reoriented. My favorite show right now is, there's a new show on American TV called Abbott Elementary. I was just doing my own podcast for my class about Abbott Elementary. It's about public school teachers in a poor area in Philadelphia, and the featured teachers teach second grade. And all my life, I felt like, boy, the one job that I was really suited for was to be a second grade teacher. But instead of becoming a second grade teacher, I became a child clinical psychologist. And what I found is you work with kids in a very different way. The problems are much bigger and more difficult. And I think I would have liked having a different group of 25 second graders each year and getting to know them and getting to teach them and trying to help them. And but I do get to teach undergraduates who are not as rewarding as second graders, but so it's tricky to figure out what really suits you, what you're motivated for, it's a hard thing, and it takes us a long time.
Because you mentioned on your path to kind of figuring out what you would like to do, the importance of kind of being in touch with your values and how that plays a role in motivation. And since you studied and researched motivation, I'm kind of wondering if there is some lessons or kind of guidelines about the association between values and motivation, and if some values are better than others, and just generally how they maybe interact.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I'm not sure I have a very coherent answer to it, but I always tried to sort out, what do I, Richard Koestner, with my life experience and my own view on things, want to do? And then what do others want me to do? Or what are the norms out there that might be influencing me to want to do something? So I was the second of 3 children in an immigrant family. My mom, I think, fit the stereotype of an immigrant mom who really wants her kids to do well in school. And she wanted my brother to be a doctor. And when it was clear that he wasn't going to reach that, she wanted me to be a doctor. And we both became PhDs. My brother a chemist, me a psychologist. And my sister is a nurse practitioner. uh, which in the United States is pretty close to being a doctor. uh, but so all of us have to sort out kind of what our families are expecting, what our parents are expecting, even what our teachers are expecting. I've been so struck that there's such an emphasis on women in STEM sciences, women in the STEM field, and I've had, outstanding PhD psychologists, women, who told me that when they were in high school, they got incredible pressure to not stop studying math and science because they were good at it and they were women. So they really should go for it. But they really like psychology, or some of them like something else. And kind of distinguishing, what you should do from what, like, your sense is you really want to do. And, sometimes you might decide, I guess, well, I'm going to do what my family wants. We need good doctors. It will be okay for me. But if you want to be a second grade teacher, it would be nice if we lived in a society where being second grade teacher was valued and where you would receive a decent pay for it and good support. And most of us, if we step back and thought about it, we would say, oh my gosh, second grade teachers are really important. But when you're a young person, you don't get that message. You get the message that, boy, if you're going to be a second grade teacher, that must mean you can only teach second grade stuff. And that you're not that smart and you weren't that good at school, and you're consigning yourself to like a limited future. And I just, that always makes me upset. Although I fell into the trap myself. I'm not a second grade teacher. I'm a university professor, which is pretty prestigious. In my second or third year at McGill, someone told me that in Quebec, if you're a university professor, you're in the top 3 percentile in terms of socioeconomic status. So, and the doctors aren't paid too well here, so I'm not even too far from the doctors.
So it's interesting because it seems to be that you kind of compartmentalized it into different sort of like units of potential motivations. There's kind of social expectations that people have. There's maybe familial ones. Maybe there's like a large scale, more like ideological ones, just from like, norms within someone's country or like religion. And then there's like this sort of internal kind of motivational force. And there's a lot of media that's kind of the main message around it is to like find yourself, to be true to yourself. How do you think people get in touch and kind of, because it's easier said than done, how do they parse through all of those other kind of conflicting motivational forces and they actually like listen to themselves and pursue like their own values?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and you highlight how difficult it is to sort through all of the motivational forces that might be impacting us. And the first thing is to become aware of them. And something that's really important is people sometimes misunderstand this idea of listening to your own voice and finding your own interests. It's not something you have to do entirely on your own. And you probably don't want to shut out all of the information that like your mentors and your teachers and your parents are giving you. Generally, the theory I work with suggests it's good to be open and aware of all of those motivational forces, but then to reflect and to, in some kind of meaningful way, make a judgment of what suits you best right now in your life where you're living. And so I do think sometimes people can say, well, I'd really like, well, here's an example. I know a lot of people who like music. And I had a student who was a former Philharmonic performer. And her experience was that a lot of professional musicians have problems with anxiety, performance anxiety, and they take beta blockers. And music is incredibly competitive. And to be a solo performer who can be hired to do concerts, that's a real long shot. And the two musicians who I know who were happiest being musicians only did music as a second thing, not as a first thing. So I had a hairdresser who was a marvelous man, Vincent. He died about 10 years ago in his 70s. And he was a trumpet player, and he loved playing the trumpet. But his father had a heart attack when he was 12 years old. And he had a mom and some younger siblings. So he became a hairstylist. He also invested in a lot of real estate. He became very successful. He raised a great family. But he played his trumpet 2 hours a day throughout his life. And when he was in his 60s, his wife sadly died of cancer. And he knew this Quebec pop star. And the pop star invited him to be a trumpet player as he traveled around Quebec and other places. And for the last 5 years of his life, he was a trumpet player. But he always loved playing the trumpet. Then I have my family practitioner, my doctor, is also a trumpet player. He's a very good doctor, but he plays the trumpet, and he has a band, and they do like weddings and bar mitzvahs and other kinds of parties, and he loves playing music, or at least he did the last time I talked to him about it. And so sometimes this is a funny thing. If you're a musician, that dream of becoming a solo performer is so difficult and so unachievable. The best thing to do might be to become a doctor or a hairdresser and do what you love as an avocation rather than as a vocation. And even me, with my interest in being a school teacher, I could have volunteered at schools, been a soccer coach. You like basketball, Ben, and I used to love the coaches I had. Not all of them, but most of them. And I could have connected with kids as a basketball coach or something. I didn't do that. I probably should have. But it's really hard to find. But let me talk a little bit more about what it means to listen to this voice and figure out what you want to do. We use the term autonomy, and by that we mean you feel volitional and you feel like you fully endorse what you're doing. And that when you're doing this activity, this chosen activity, it feels wholehearted rather than half-hearted or conflicted. And we find that if you have goals where you're wholeheartedly behind them, it means you're not dealing with the resistance and the ambivalence. It means you're behaving flexibly, you have maximum interest, and you generally do a better job of staying with things, learning, and progressing. So I've really worked at trying to figure out, what are the things that I feel autonomous about? And the one key thing I want to tell you is that there's actually two paths to feeling autonomous. The one I love the most and cared about the most is something I call intrinsic motivation, which is there's just some things I like, I enjoy, and I want to do it. So basketball was like that. The first time I played basketball, it was, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. It's a great team sport. So that's one way. It's this intrinsic motivation. Reading was like that. And one of the sad things in our lives is that many of the activities that were intrinsically motivated, we lose that intrinsic motivation. We lose the interest in reading because once we get into school, teachers start trying to control the way we read. They try to encourage us to read more or read certain kinds of things. Reading is associated with doing well. So it gets co-opted. So intrinsic motivation is one form of autonomy. But once we're like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, there's a second form of autonomy, which has to do with deciding that certain things are meaningful and that you care about these. And that also can lead you to fully endorse it and wholeheartedly stand behind it. And the ideal is if you have both. If you have like a natural interest and you also find a way to channel that interest so that you believe you're doing something worthwhile and meaningful. And that's the combination that's associated with the most resilient persistence, the most flexible adaptation, and the highest levels of need satisfaction and happiness, and probably the best protection against stress and mental illness.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I think very important to kind of clarify when people are talking about like finding yourself or being yourself or doing what you want to do, that it is like that there's sort of an affective element to it that I think could help people kind of know when they're actually pursuing these goals.
I like that. Yeah, affective or something deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that's good.
And you also just mentioned one of the components to autonomous, sort of the experience of autonomy is need satisfaction. Could you maybe explain further what that measurement is?
Yeah. So the theory I work with is called Self-Determination Theory, and it does focus on how we approach our activities and regulate our behavior, and is it autonomous or is it controlled? But it also has an idea about how we learn, how we develop, how we grow, and how we experience well-being. And it suggests that there's 3 fundamental psychological needs. Now, some people have suggested there's 40, there's 20. This theory says you could boil it down to 3. These are the essential ones. And the acronym I use for it is ARC, A-R-C. And I would suggest the arc of our lives is determined by whether we are able to satisfy these 3 needs. So I'll tell you what they are. The one I told you about already is autonomy, so that I've defined how you can measure it. And self-determination theory would say it's essential that in all of the context in which you spend your day, so with your family, at school, when you're playing basketball, when I'm with my friends, in each of those situations, I can ask myself, do people accept me as I am? Am I free to act volitionally? Can I be myself? Or do I feel like I have to behave a certain way? Is there a demand? And is there pressure? So autonomy, and the theory I work with says that all 3 needs are important, but it does kind of highlight autonomy. It says there's something maybe a little extra special about that. But the next need, which is the one all of you have recognized, you know this one, is called relatedness or connectedness or attachment. And that refers to the fact that you need to feel like there's some people you care for who reciprocally care back for you. It doesn't have to be everyone. It could be a small group. But oh my, if you feel like there's no one who you can connect with and who cares back to you, that's isolation. And that's a really sad place to be. So we need autonomy and we need relatedness. And the theory would say you need that in all of the different roles you fill. You need that with all the goals you pursue. And you need that in all of the milieus that you function in. Uh, so if you're a parent and your kid comes back from second grade, you want to hear how they describe their first day of class, how they describe the teacher, how they describe the other kids. And you want to get a sense, boy, do they feel like they can be themselves, which is autonomy? Do they feel like they have people who care about them there? That's relatedness. And then the third need is competence. And my guess is that most of your audience relates to this the most. And competence has to do with being able to do things well, to master the tasks that are before you. And I'm guessing you have a very educated audience, and that if you've been in schools, it feels good to be able to master a language, to do well on your test, to write outstanding papers. And I think some of us focus more on competence than the other two. And some of us may sacrifice autonomy or sacrifice relatedness in the pursuit of competence. But so the three needs are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And there's a little bit more complexity to this need part of the theory. It suggests that you first have to think about whether it's being satisfied, more or less, but you also have to consider whether there are social forces out there that are actually thwarting your efforts to feel autonomous, related, and competent. And so when my daughter was in 4th or 5th grade, there were some bullies who used to bully her. And that was thwarting her need to feel competent, her need to feel related. And it was relational bullying, so it really damaged. And when your needs are being thwarted, not only don't you have well-being, that's when you're going to have ill-being. That's when you're going to develop anxiety, depression, other kinds of things. And it's not just bullies who do that. You can also think about people in our society who are discriminated against in a systematic way. So there's very good evidence that if you're a person of color, particularly if you're a black person, that when you go to school, the teachers act differently toward you. Other kids act differently toward you. If I was a black man and if I'm walking home tonight, and if I'm on a street and there's a woman in front of me, a white woman, she's likely to feel scared and like move away. And black men have to learn to do things to kind of signify I'm not dangerous. So a great psychologist gave a talk here at McGill where he said he used to whistle Vivaldi. He was a black psychologist, a big guy, but he would whistle Vivaldi whenever he was walking on a street so that it would signal. But so there's kind of systemic reactions that are actually making people feel like others are scared of them or others doubt them. And so there's the three basic needs. They can be satisfied or less satisfied, but they can be actively thwarted by particular people, by groups of people, or by societal norms that kind of permit or encourage discriminating against certain individuals and groups.
So how do you think, and this is quite a big question, and kind of putting you on the spot, but how do you think when need thwarting reaches sort of systemic levels and there's kind of institutionalized or socialized need thwarting going on and it's at the detriment of individuals, how do you think like society in just broadly could kind of overcome this or kind of ensure that need satisfaction is maybe not guaranteed, but at the very least need thwarting is reduced?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and it's very relevant in Quebec right now. There was just we're having a leadership. There's an election going on. We're in the middle of the campaign, and the five Quebec leaders had a debate yesterday, and uh, I've been very struck by the fact that the ruling party in Quebec, the CAQ, they contend that there's no systemic discrimination against black people in Quebec. On the other hand, if you look at newspaper reports, you'll see many examples in hospital settings or just out on the street where uh, black people, First Nations people experience things that white guys like me don't experience. I have this funny example where when I was your age, Ben, I used to get traffic tickets like for rolling through a stop sign or something. But then about once I got into my 40s, I had a streak of being stopped 5 times by police. And each time they said, oh, no, we're not going to give you a ticket. You just go on. You could just take this as a warning. And that's because I was a middle-aged white guy. That does not happen to black people. That does not happen. So how can you change society? I would think, first of all, if you are not acknowledging that there is systemic racism in the way different people are treated, uh, this there's something seriously wrong with your understanding of what it's like to be a racial minority or what it's like to be in a historically discriminated against group. So it gets very complicated though, Ben, because uh, it's like then you wonder, okay, can white people do more? Uh, there is this notion of allyship where those of us in the majority group maybe could do more, but people do different things with that, and I'm not sure. So there's always a concern that the allyship might be more performative rather than genuine, and I think that's getting at this question of motivation too. Why are these people acting like allies, and how are they doing it? And is it coming from a good faith place, or is it performative in some way? I think we should have laws that prohibit, uh, you know, hate crimes. That there are hate crimes. I think we should have hate crimes for little hateful things that people do. I kind of wish I could report hate crimes when I'm in my car or walking down the street because I think there's a lot of hateful things that people are doing in their everyday life that are often they target particular vulnerable people and they're really hurtful. So I haven't really thought about how to solve that, but I would love it if in Quebec we had a political party that stood up to the current party and that had the courage to say, how can you possibly say there's no systemic racism? What world are you living in? Have you ever talked to a black parent about what they have to talk to their sons about? It's just unbelievable that well-educated people could say no. There's no racism in our society.
I like that you brought up the fact of like allyship and how that's it can be kind of a problematic and complicated social discussion because a lot of people do use it in terms of like virtue signaling and
yeah, that's good.
Yeah, not like performative, not entirely
yeah.
Like honestly, and I actually think it ties in maybe like a more positive form of what allyship could be in regards to people of one group that's less marginalized trying to help another group that's more marginalized is in terms of autonomy support, which is the sort of which you could further define. But if you think maybe that might be a sort of strategy that does a better job than sort of performative allyship.
I like that, and then I study autonomy support a lot, and even though I am doing some community work, I haven't thought about what you just said. That makes sense. Uh, I also, again, I think I'm in kind of a quarrelsome mood. So because it's Friday, I also think the performative people should be called out more for their insincere efforts at allyship and support. And what it means to be autonomy supportive, that means being able to take the other person's perspective and feel what it's been like to be them. And I don't even know if I could do that when you think about what is it like to be a First Nations. I'm a 60-year-old guy. What would my life be like now if I was a 60-year-old guy who was First Nations? Or if I was a 60-year-old guy who was a black person and lived, so in order to be autonomy supportive, we need to put ourselves in the other person's place. And that's a very hard thing to do because I'm a 60-year-old white guy who the police don't even give me tickets. I don't know what I'd have to do to get a ticket from a policeman. I do get parking tickets. Those are the only tickets I get. But no, I don't know the answer to how, as a majority kind of person, how we can really have an influence on other majority people to somehow change things so that there's not so much discrimination and there aren't so many microaggressions and it's hard to know how to change things, and also whether I'm in the vantage point and I have a position where I can change things. These are new thoughts you're giving me here, so I haven't really worked through them.
No, but I also do think that whether or not either of us could answer that, it's already very significant that, especially in the field of psychological research, we're really trying to define what it means when somebody feels autonomous, when somebody feels motivated, intrinsic, when they feel like they're living well. Because so many of these sort of social movements that are for liberation or some form of equality, the kind of end goal tends to be kind of what autonomy ends up looking like. So I think in a way it's already like this theory would already be doing its job in that it's kind of defining the objective in a more kind of scientific way.
No, I like that. And the other thing that this theory is doing, and it's beginning to look at our needs at both the personal and at the group level. So, I feel pretty autonomous most of the time. I feel connected. I feel competent. Now, that all might be true, but if I'm a racialized minority, I might say, okay, this is how I feel. But when I look at my community, oh my gosh, they had the highest rates of COVID, they have the highest unemployment, there's other problems in the community. So there's a dichotomy or a discrepancy between my personal and my group or collective, and that's really hard, and there's evidence now that will filter into your personal need satisfaction. That cannot be ignored. But that only happens if we're racialized minorities. If we're part of the white majority, it's just our personal need satisfaction that matters. Now, that actually can be twisted with the MAGA Republicans, they feel like they are a discriminated against minority because they're not allowed to talk about Christmas to everyone, and they're not allowed to send everyone Christmas cards, and they're not allowed to force people to pray. But that's, almost everyone could see that that's some kind of crazy, twisty logic involved in that. But most often it's the issue of collective need satisfaction kind of filtering into your personal need satisfaction, sometimes overwhelming it. That's more when you're ethnic, racial minority, or if something brings attention to it. Something that I'm really interested in, and Ben, you always have such great ideas. I'm very curious about what's happening with Canadians who are from, who have a Ukrainian heritage versus a Russian heritage. I don't know what your heritage. I'm guessing you're Scottish English. I'm Austrian, but that's pretty close to. Well, maybe it's not so close.
I'm actually I'm Scottish Ukrainian, so that's a.
Oh my gosh! Okay, so you're on. Okay, so I'm not Ukrainian, but this is a David and Goliath story, and I thought, oh, poor Ukraine is going to be destroyed, and they put up such a valiant fight that I'm listening to a 45-minute news report every day, Ukraine the latest. I'm looking at the maps. I feel a little bad because I'm mostly spectating like the progress that's being made, and I don't focus enough on all of the pain and torture and hardship. But I'm interested in what Ukrainian Canadians like yourself, what the last 6 months have been like, because my guess is something is going on with you that would be different than, like, you're more aware of being a Ukrainian and having that heritage perhaps in the last 6 months than usual. And what I would be guessing is there's some shock, there's some horror, but there's also great pride in, especially if you hear about the brilliant way that the Ukrainian people are being trained and how the women are fighting with the men and how it's so clear that they're motivated for this fight. But on the Russian side, it's conscripts who are being forced to do it, and there's a big difference. So in Canada, let's say in Manitoba, there's 20,000 Ukrainians, but there's probably also 20,000 like Russians. And what's happening with those Russians in terms of, oh my, what are they learning about Russia? And do they have that view of Russia? Like my view of Russia, I always thought, the education's great. It's amazing. I always thought I'd want to, but oh my gosh, I've been shaken by what I'm learning about what seems to be happening in this war and the way Russian society, it sounds like Moscow and St. Petersburg are like the golden cities where everyone lives well, but every place else there, it's not so good. So I think this is an interesting case where the collective needs, we may become aware of what's happening to groups we relate to and identify with, and it's going to impact how we feel and how we're doing. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
do you think it might be similar to like before the pandemic, you might have had friends that you never really talked politics with, and then because of something that became kind of a political event, unfortunately, suddenly you became a lot more aware of your own political beliefs, and your friends became a lot more aware. So it's like kind of casting light on like collective identities all of a sudden.
Well, I think it's been very scary, and I think we've chatted about this in the past, but like I'm very much a person who trusts science and trusts doctors, And Tony Fauci went to the same high school, the Jesuit high school that I went to. And he's our greatest alumni ever. And he's been vilified. He needs he needs a security detail around him and his family because the MAGA Republicans have made him the enemy. So, that's a really interesting thing. I would guess 2 years ago, no one would have thought that we would split into two groups based on whether we trusted COVID vaccines or not. And I was really surprised at some people who were in my acquaintanceship network who were really anti-vaccine and who were convinced and who thought I was crazy for not being anti-vaccine. And I couldn't have predicted ahead of time. So it is social forces, political forces. They can reshape things a little bit, especially at this collective level. To be honest, it's really thrown me off, Ben. And I see some people who I now know are on the other side and who went to join the convoys that were against vaccines. And I have a hard time like relating to them the same way I used to. And it's really, and that's hard when you feel like, oh boy, there's a gulf between me and this person. And I would have, but I had that already in the US. So if anyone supports Trump, I kind of thought, oh my gosh, that's going to be hard for me to relate to you. He's such an evil person.
Maybe because we're already going a little bit past time. But if you have maybe on a lighter note, any sort of advice for any students that are considering pursuing psychology.
Yeah. So. I find motivation psychology, personality psychology very interesting. I know that sometimes people perceive psychology as like a soft science or a social science. I think there's a lot of useful, interesting things that can help you in your everyday life. It could help you relate to others. And I think it's good to spend some time figuring out, boy, what am I interested in? What do I care about? And what the heck are these forces out there that are trying to get me to do this or that? And how do I become aware of them? And how do I sort out, taking into account people I trust, how do I sort out which path I want to take? So I think psychology can be very helpful in all of that. So thanks a lot, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on and spending some time to talk. That was very interesting. Yeah, thank you.